the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Let's begin it.
Number ZZ9 plural Z alpha. Number ZZ9. I said I've never seen such hideousness in all my life.
Listen to all of this,
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with money.
But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 303. Still a college level class, right? Some facts about early suffrage might shock you. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with nonsense annihilator Lauren Brooks and the personification of perceptivity, Mike Stevenson. And tonight we're going to discuss the evolution of suffrage, or at least the beginning of the evolution of suffrage. And we've got a few surprises in that discussion. Just a little bit. But before we do that, we gotta do what we gotta do. As always, Honey Badger Radio dishes out a smorgasbord of thought-provoking discussions, and as experiences both recent and long past have demonstrated, the provoked thoughts, are fighting back. They made it clear that for people like us, relying on third-party payment platforms like Patreon to fund our work is treading on thin ice, or building our house in the path of a rapidly growing wildfire. In light of this, we strongly encourage our supporters to switch at least their support for us to feedthebadger.com, the most stable way to help us out. And if you want to tip us directly instead of relying on any social media platform's tip jar, the link for that is feedthebadger.com/justthetip. And as always, the same risk applies to our social media platforms, which is why you should further provoke the thought police by tracking our thought-provoking discussions on honeybadgerbrigade.com, where you can find your way to all of our content as well as a link to feedthebadger.com in the drop-down menu at the top of the page. So, last week we kind of learned how the concepts of parliamentary government and voting evolved in medieval Scotland, England, Wales, Ireland. We looked at how that evolution intrinsically ties the concept of voting rights to civic duty and military service, despite feminist protests to the contrary. This week, we're moving forward with the next steps getting more complicated. So we're probably going to see this topic continue for a while, and by for a while, I mean I'm not even getting into the formation this week of the United States and Canada and Australia as countries with their own voting mechanisms that didn't necessarily spring from the British motherland. And the difference there is like different time periods were going on when different countries came into being. So the United States was the first of the three and sort of was influenced by the French Revolution and had its pathway and its evolution of voting rights. And the United States didn't all come into being at once. You know, you had some states form and out of the colonies, and then you had territories that didn't gain statehood until much later. And I mean, the last state to gain entry into the Union gained entry during the 20th century. So we're a few centuries behind that. And voting evolved into past, actually, the middle of the 20th century in the United States as well. There was quite a bit of change there. So we'll probably do that, and we'll start with that next week. And as I said in the show notes, let's see if I've got this. Okay, it did come up good. And I'm not gonna go just like read the whole thing, but at the end of this, I have a note about that. So, as we discuss this history, though, we did pretty much establish like the connection to military service, the connection to payment of at least proto-taxes and then taxes, and then the connection to service to country as things that were qualifying factors in having the right to vote in the medieval Commonwealth. So now we're going to look at what happened next. And the one thing that I will point out is we pretty well established, as I said here, the concept of suffrage can no more be divorced from men's historical obligations than a person could be surgically separated from their DNA. It's how it was created. It's how it came to be. So when feminists tell you that because men in the United States can vote even if they don't sign up for the draft, and they won't stop you from voting even if you don't sign up for the draft, unless they start enforcing the aspect of the law that says you can be arrested and thrown in jail for not signing up for selective service to be drafted. And they throw a fit about, well, there's not a draft right now. It doesn't matter, because voting wouldn't exist in Western culture without that. If we were still under the old system, the old monarchy system, where you had to trust that the king would even, or the queen, would even take advice from the Great Council, and they hadn't fought for the right to make that input and the right for commoners to be involved, nobody would have voting rights. There wouldn't be this discussion about men's voting rights and women's voting rights and when they came about and how they came about, because it wouldn't exist. We would be remembering it as a failed system that Greece tried and nobody else liked.
You'll like to think you diverged from the British system in all the right ways. And I guess you did in some of the right ways, along the lines of no taxation without representation. But it never occurred to any of you to diverge from the gynocentric system that was already underway in what we called the British Empire at the time. This is why we were sailing across the world, doing anything but attending to our hideous fat pigs of wives. That's what you should have drawn yourselves away from. But you didn't. You did everything except draw yourselves away from that. You were like, yeah, we don't want to pay money to the king, but we're quite happy to pay everything we earn to our fat pigs of wives, because there weren't fat pigs of wives at the time, because you're subsisting on new tracts of land, and you were a world behind the advanced prosperity of the British Empire, which at the time was so advanced that they could afford to give women everything they want. And while the American Empire, the Canadian Empire, and the Australian Empire were busy living off the land, you became that self-sufficient society that the British Empire always should have been. But you still had that grain of gynocentrism in your brains that made you go, well, let's give everything to the women, even though we're building barns every day like the Amish still do. You still couldn't help yourselves. You had to be like, let's give everything to the women, even though we can't afford to. Let's do that, and let's build upon that.
Seemed like a good idea. Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Never mind what's going to happen 100 years from now if we keep plugging away at that particular way of thinking. And yeah, I'm not judging anyone. Like the British Empire did this to everyone. The British Empire brought the world prosperity, but it also brought the world this particular brand of gynocentrism.
You could actually blame the French for that. And one of these days we're going to go visit gynocentrism.com and read about that, because Peter Wright's done quite a bit of research into the subject, and it really deserves its own show. The information that he has compiled and written about it, like, honestly, is something that the men's rights movement needs to understand, because we have this debate going on in regard to gynocentrism, and there's a lot of evidence that prior to the introduction of romantic chivalry by French courtesans, that really wasn't, like, what we see as gynocentrism today, modern gynocentrism, is a whole different animal from what historically could be called gynocentrism. And it really was more focused on maintaining family structure and children and so on, not prioritizing women just because we're women. That's a major change in human behavior that took place. But and we'll probably have to do more history studies just to go over that and to relate that to the development of the other issues. Because if you look at the rest of men's issues, almost all of it stems from that change, including the increased disposability of men and the elimination of any disposability in regard to women, where, historically, if you were done having babies, you could be as disposable as a man. And because that's what gynocentrism was about. It wasn't about women. It was about women's function in regard to the protection and upbringing of children. And, if you're not doing that anymore, then it doesn't apply to you. Except now, and in modern times, it does. But in regard to the whole taxation without representation thing, I always thought that was an American invention, that cry of no taxation without representation. But it's not.
It survived in us long enough to 2016, That's
Yeah.
why Brexit happened.
Well, it's also why the First Barons' War happened. Like, that's King John wanted the barons to fund things that the barons didn't want to fund, and he refused to listen to the Great Council. And the barons were like, fuck you, we're going to war. Like, none of this taxation without us getting a say in what's going on here. None of this. We're not paying you to do stuff that we think you're failing at. So yeah, it was essentially a cry of no taxation without representation. If you want our money, you better get our word.
A cry that was exactly 2 words too long, by the way.
Yeah.
The first 2 words is all you need. No taxation.
Taxation, yes.
Yeah. Any other endeavor, so we went over how your country, your government, any form of government acts as a corporation. It's a group acting as one, and it has its own, financial activity and everything, right? But any other corporation, if my little LLC, for instance, if I decided that I wanted money to expand what I do beyond service to the Honey Badger Brigade, and to just start making informational videos as a profession for other organizations, and I wanted a loan of some sort, or to be given a grant, or anything for that, I would have to write a proposal or get a grant writer to write a proposal and go to organizations that have money and ask them for it, and they could tell me no. But if your government wants to do something stupid, like fund experimentation to see how fast different brands of ketchup run across a tilted table, that really did happen, by the way. Our government here in the United States funded that once.
Oh my God.
They just take it from you. You don't get to say no, because if you say no, then they come after you with jackbooted thugs and throw you in jail for non-payment of your taxes.
Yep.
Yeah. And of course, we've all totally benefited from. Oh wait, I still don't know which brand of ketchup actually lost the race or won the race. What the benefit of that was, Yeah. So there you go. So we're getting to the point of what happened next. And so one of the things I found, I thought I was going to have to go through another 200 years of history with wars and battles and protests and stuff. And I was under the impression that a lot more people had voting rights at the beginning of the 19th century than actually did. So what I found out is, and this was from a lot of different sources, official sources, unofficial sources, research papers, actually no, it didn't change much. Very little changed between the 1430 32 Knights of the Shire Act and the 1832 Reform Act. So from Anglopedia.net's The History of Voting Rights in the United Kingdom by John Raybon, it points out the Knights of the Shire Act was the first parliamentary legislation to establish who was enfranchised, gave the vote to the 40-shilling freeholders, meaning only owners of real property who paid taxes to the crown of at least 40 shillings a year, which is roughly 2,500 pounds in today's money, could vote. And this remained the status quo for another 400 years, even after the passage of the Bill of Rights, 1869, that provided for regular parliamentary elections. And it's interesting to note, a survey from 1780, remember the United States formed in 1776, right? Survey from 1780 revealed that the number of enfranchised voters amounted to only 3% of the United Kingdom's population.
Wow.
So, when the United States became a country, only 3% of people in the UK and in the English Commonwealth could vote. From Kettle Mag's Suffrage in the UK, a brief study of the history of the vote, we have the changes that took place, there we go, in 1688. This was referred to as the Glorious Revolution, when King James II of England was overthrown by a union formed between English parliamentarians and William III, Prince of Orange. I'm not gonna make a Trump joke. I'm not. I will behave.
The Dutch are here listening to you going, yeah, we get it. All of our kings have been orange for centuries or whatever.
Orange man. Before William could ascend to the throne with James's daughter Mary II of England, they both had to accept the Bill of Rights, which was released in 1689. So the United States wasn't the first place to have a Bill of Rights either. Like, that name didn't get invented by our forefathers. It was a concept that existed. So when they created the Bill of Rights that were part of our Constitution, there was a historical standing for that. This bill guaranteed certain rights of England's citizens and protected them from the power of the Crown. It established the principles of having frequent parliaments, free elections, and freedom of speech. Does that sound familiar, guys? Within Parliament. The bill...
freedom of speech? No, that does not sound familiar.
Like, we stole it and then you guys didn't take it back. The bill was also supplemented later by the 1701 Act of Settlement. Together they reduced the powers of the Crown and contributed to parliamentary sovereignty. And that's what makes Parliament the most powerful government institution in the country. It was only in the 19th century that there was radical change in suffrage and even further reform within Parliament. So again, we have that established. There we go. Albert Nader Retro gave us $2 just now and said, Heinz lost, women most effect, and patriarchy. Yeah, and we have some other comments about that. I like the thick rich one. That's women most affected. The thick rich one, women most affected. And that could be taken a whole bunch of different ways. So there you go. But yeah, very few people could vote in 1800s Britain. In England and Wales, this was less than 3% of the population of nearly 8 million, and in Scotland, only 4,500 out of 2.6 million. UK government...
And many of them were female, by the way.
Yeah. So
let's not go down that route.
We are going down that road later. This is our Easter egg. Easter's over, but we still have an Easter egg. But the UK government's National Archive website summarizes the conditions that led to the Great Reform Act of 1832 as follows. And this is where things start to actually change, and the meat of the show is coming up here. So the Reform Act became law in response to years of criticism of the electoral system from those outside and inside Parliament. The rabble was rousing, guys. Elections in Britain were neither fair nor representative. In order to vote, a person had to own property or pay certain taxes to qualify, which excluded most working class people. In other words, if I was a male or female citizen in Britain during that time, or in I think all of the parts of the Commonwealth, I wouldn't have had voting rights. Most of our listeners probably wouldn't have had voting rights. You know, if you're not a property owner, a landowner, like you don't have a house on land that you own, and that's, I think, even even people who, I don't know if mortgages existed at the time, but even people who were renting, if they were not earning enough to pay a significant amount in taxes, like that, the British pound is still worth more than the dollar by quite a bit. So we're talking over, I would say over 3,000, probably closer to 4,000 a year in taxes. Right? And most people aren't going to qualify. Sorry.
Effectively, we still don't have any functional voting rights. We can choose between the Conservatives, who are a bunch of communists, or Labour, who are a bunch of communists, or the Liberal Democrat Party, who are a bunch of communists, or even the Reform Party. The Reform Party, who was supposed to be finally an alternative to a bunch of communists, but it turns out they do everything that Hope Not Hate coerces them into doing, revealing that they too are a bunch of communists.
It's just a different flavor of communist that you haven't tried before yet, babe. This one might be good.
At least we're not a two-party system. We have like 5 if you include the Green Party, who are the biggest communists of all. We have 5 different communist parties to choose from, but we totally have a say in what happens to our country.
It's really sad. We're at a point, and the United States is in the same kind of boat. We're at a point where we can't even trust that if somebody says things that sound good in terms of, policy that don't sound communist, that they're not actually secretly a communist who is, running under a banner of anti-communism, but actually saying, well, we need to use the government to do this, and we need to use the government to do that. We need to make this collective, and we need to make that collective. And in order to do that, we need more government control over your lives. And by the way, we're going to spy on you some more too. Like they're all really part of the same thought group. They're all part of the same, I don't know, cult. Even if they're not part of the same party, even if they think they have massive differences, they're still trying to impose collectivism. And here it's more socialist. It's more using the government as a stand-in for the people taking control of pretty much every form of means of production in the country, whether it's business that produces actual physical things, or business that produces intellectual property, your use of that intellectual property, your relationship to the business, whether or not things you buy belong to you after you've bought them. Like it's all socialism. So yeah, our voting rights have expanded, but our choices from which we're selecting when we exercise those rights have condensed, and it's all authoritarianism in the end. But it has expanded. So working class people can vote now, but they couldn't then. There was another issue, and we've had great debate over this in the United States as well. There were constituencies with like several voters instead of several hundred voters or 1,000 voters that elected 2 members of parliament to parliament, such as Old Sarum and Salisbury. These were called rotten boroughs because they had almost no population in comparison to other places that had significantly larger populations but didn't have representation commensurate with the size of the population. It was actually instead much less per capita, because you had 2 members of parliament representing a huge number of people. So they basically
and a dog called Colin.
Yeah, and a dog called Colin. So they basically reformed that. And then there were some that had no representation as well. Industrial towns like Manchester or Birmingham had grown over time but had no members of parliament. In 1831, the House of Commons passed a reform bill, but the House of Lords, dominated by the Tory party, defeated it. This was followed by riots and serious disturbances in London, in Birmingham, in Derby, Nottingham, and I think this is pronounced Leicester, and Yeovil. Leicester, really?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. I
Like
know.
your uncle.
Okay.
Like your Uncle Lester.
So is Yeovil pronounced Yeovil, or is it something else?
Yes, no, that's Yeovil. Well done.
Okay. Because it looks like it could also be pronounced evil, but that would be hilarious and probably wouldn't be right. Sherborne, Exeter, and Bristol. The page further states that the act itself only gave the franchise to middle-class men. So it still didn't give, the back then equivalent of today's retail and gas station workers the vote. It gave it to owners of small businesses, people who earn as much as maybe a elementary school teacher or a construction worker, but not to adults working in places like McDonald's as long-term employees or anything like that, right? For modern equivalent. So back then it would have been people working in factories might not have made enough. People working in coal mines might not have made enough. And that would be men and women were working in coal mines up until Queen Victoria got upset that women were working in such harsh conditions and decided to put the kibosh to that and ended their jobs because, that helped their families so much.
Yeah, he sounds like he was a really rough boss, that Victor.
Yeah, that patriarchal. Oh wait. So what we're seeing is, over time, the things that affected the right to vote were not necessarily, up until the 19th century, they were not necessarily laws expanding voting rights. They were other things. Here's another bit from Ryan Miller's paper, A Dire Need for Parliamentary Reform, or the Role of Elite Fears in Britain's Great Reform Bill of 1832. And he has another perspective, because they talked about briefly in the previous one the riots and everything, and it was sort of glossed over, like here you have these people who are angry, but it was quashed. The Parliament was having none of that, and that was the end of it. Until then later, that there was this law that was passed, but that's not all of it. So Miller writes that the examination of parliamentary debate. So he had there's notes of the debate on the floor, and then there's also communications, private correspondence that he cites between the pro-reform party and the anti-reform party, which was the Whigs and the Tories, demonstrates that fear of revolution launched by France and catalyzed by Bristol, by the British elite, was the primary motivator for reform. They were afraid that they were going to experience what the French elites would experience when the French people got mad. And fortunately, in the more recent revolution, as opposed to the initial revolution, heads didn't roll, but they still did take down one administration and replace it with another. So you still had, they were afraid for still the acts of violence and the potential for great destruction of property, and there is always the potential that the people they think of as riffraff will execute them. like that, because that has happened historically numerous times in various places all around the world. But even if they didn't get executed, they would still lose everything.
You'd think people would learn their lesson. I mean, the French Revolution put the fear of God into various monarchies across Europe. After that happened, they were like, "Oh shit, we'd better pull this shit back, otherwise our heads are going to roll as well." But shortly after the French Revolution happened, a certain young man named Napoleon happened, and he tried to take over Europe in much the same way a certain Adolf Hitler tried to take over Europe less than a century later. And you thought this would have put the reverse fear of God into everyone and made people go, right, yeah, maybe monarchy can go too far, but maybe the excesses of Republican agendas can also go too far, as represented by Napoleon. That when you remove the monarchy, you create a void in power, whatever it's called. I forget what the popular phrase is, but this hole in a waterfall that you think is going to remain a hole, but this void in power is inevitably going to be filled by someone else, and you have to be very careful. When you create this hole in the power structure, because it's going to be filled. And this is what we should have learned from the French Revolution. That it's a good idea to not piss on the working class quite so much, but at the same time, if that power vacuum, that's the phrase I was thinking of, power vacuum. If that power vacuum is filled just as drastically as the power vacuum of monarchy was emptied, then you can find yourself in a situation as dire as the French found themselves in. And what we should have learned from this is to reduce the centralized power without reducing it so much that it becomes just as centralized by fucking communists. Because that's gonna result in a shit show of affairs that was even worse than monarchy ever should have been. What the French should have done was reduce the power of the monarchy, but I guess it got so bad that they were given no choice but to exact these extreme measures. And like I said, what the rest of the world should have learned was to reduce those powers gradually rather than extremely. And I suppose that was that was the moral lesson learned by the United States, that they didn't go ahead and adopt the kind of monarchy that the British were under at the time, but not quite the kind of republic that the French had already found themselves inexorably plunged into, and they kind of found a middle ground. And good on them for doing that, but
it was stated, if you can maintain it. That was the hard part. And where
a republic, if you can keep it.
If you can keep it, yeah. Where the United States went wrong was lapsing back into the belief that you can just trust somebody with ambition and with somebody who's driven, somebody who has a desire for power and authority to run your whole legal system and your whole social system, even with checks and balances in place, even with three branches that compete with each other for control and that exist to say, hey, wait a minute, that rule, you can't violate that rule by doing this thing that you're doing. Like that still doesn't stop abuses of power. It stops abuses of power from taking certain pathways. But if you have somebody that's bent on abusing power, that's bent on changing the country from a representative democracy with small government to basically a socialist republic with a huge burgeoning, I don't like the term shadow government. We just have a huge burgeoning bureaucracy. There's no shadow there. It's not happening in private. Everything the government does is available to the public. The thing that makes it viewed as a shadow government is that people have gotten comfortable not paying attention. Right? And the checks and balances system that we were talked about in school is a lie. We were told that there were 3 branches of government that all kept each other in check. There are 4 branches. You are the 4th branch. And as the 4th branch, the general population of the country has not been doing its job. And as a result, the other 3 branches have decided to suppress the 4th branch. That's what's going on right now in the country. And that has to stop. And the only solution for it, the only cure for this kind of warping of the system of government that we were supposed to have in this country.
Is it more cowbell?
No. Unless you want to whack somebody upside the head in Minecraft with the cowbell. But no, what you really need to do in this instance is, instead of setting your sights on somebody who wants power and privilege and control and authority, is to keep a constant watch on the people in power, keep a constant watch on what the bureaucracy is doing, and send into higher offices people who run on a platform of getting rid of the excesses of government, reducing the bureaucracy, reducing the power, reducing the control over the public, and going back to a more skeleton of a government like we were supposed to have in the beginning. And that's going to be hard because the bureaucracy responds to those people like an immune system responds to a virus.
Well, yeah, because I mean, essentially what they would be doing is basically arguing to lose their own jobs, you know? I mean, yeah, I think it absolutely should happen, but how are you going to convince these people?
Yeah. It's really difficult. And the worst part of it is we have a public that has become addicted to government services. And I say addicted because people are literally afraid, like they would be afraid of a tornado hitting their home or a giant stepping on it. Like they're afraid of having the food pulled out from under their noses, of losing those services. When in fact, those services cost taxpayer money that takes money out of the economy that would bolster their ability to support themselves without those services if it was in the economy. So there you go. Like that's our whole situation boils down to the political form of heroin that our country is addicted to right now and has to go. And unfortunately, that's a tool of the elite. You know, the more they throw you bread and circuses, and the more addicted they can get you to sucking on the government teat, the more control they know that you will put up with. Right? That's where we are.
What the French learned from the French Revolution, because there were originally 3 powers: the monarchy, the clergy, and the, I guess what communists would call the proletariat. And ever since then, various intimidation groups have been working on bringing down the monarchy and bringing down the clergy, and they've been very successful in those endeavors ever since then. And to this day, we've found the situation where the monarchy has already been brought down, even in the, I believe, 6 European countries where there is still a monarchy. The monarchy has no power whatsoever. And in any given country where the clergy ever had power, the clergy no longer has that power. That's a whole other argument, and not just with regards to the spiritual discussion of religious versus non-religious things. The point is, both of these two powers that previously held all the power have been replaced by the government. And the whole idea was to reduce the power of the monarchy and the clergy, and not to replace it with anything, but just to reduce it. But it has been replaced. It's been replaced by this ubiquitous power we call the government. And for all their effort, for all the efforts put into the French Revolution, it seems to have bitten everyone on the ass, because now we're not bogged down by a monarchy, and we're not bogged down by a clergy. We're bogged down by that which has replaced both of them, namely the state, the government, which is determined to not just be a nationalistic top-down power force, but a globalistic top-down power force, which has become a force that wishes not to even burden itself with any competition. That's the nature of globalism. It's the hideous marriage of monarchy and clergy, that which does not revere to any religion or any such.
It's a cult.
Obligation to the to whatever the monarchy was ever obliged, to adhere to. We now have this overarching class of people that are more powerful than the monarchy ever was, and more powerful than the clergy ever was, and that was never the point. But that's quickly become the state, which has left a lot of us wondering, maybe we were better off having a monarchy and a clergy.
It's possible that the monarchy and clergy would have ultimately resulted in the same thing. I mean, if you look back at how the clergy was involved in the Barons' War, the First Barons' War, there was still that kind of, I guess you could call it a conspiracy to maintain power, and to keep power divided between the monarchy and the church, well, with the common man excluded from it. But today, we have what we have in terms of the people in power economically in the world. You have this cult that I guess you could refer to them as humanists. They think of human beings as the ultimate. I don't think they like. There's the conspiracy theory that they worship Satan and they believe in all these old deities and everything. Like, I've heard that theory and all that, but I don't think that's the case. I think that they are so arrogant that they think humans are the end-all be-all of intelligence in the universe, and that's it. They should be able to. The smartest humans, at least in their own minds, of all humans in the world, because they've managed to get richer than everybody else. They just think that they have the right to use the rest of the people of the world as they see fit, and they're trying to institute a system that will allow them to continue to do that, and their descendants to continue to do that through all time. So there you go. And of course, that power exists because of the void that was created, again, by the fourth branch of government not doing its job and getting addicted to the services provided by the other three. We let the banks become that powerful, and we let the rest of the financial industry become that powerful because we didn't pay attention and we didn't put the brakes on what they were doing. And at some point I'll go over, there's a pattern, and I've discussed it before, I think, in a previous show, but there's a pattern of money laundering that I identified in regard to mortgage lending and other forms of property loan lending by banks and government bailouts that is facilitated by the political correctness end of politics. But that's not the subject of today's show. But the fact is, we did see historically where voting rights may not have evolved much during that 400-year period. And I think having had this up, like it pretty much says the same thing about the massive unrest, but this guy points out that the communications demonstrate that the resistance to the Whigs' arguments for reform kind of disappeared as a result of that resistance. The speeches and letters that he could find at the time demonstrate that preventing disaster, preventing the public from basically going ballistic, was the objective. So, just pointing out, and he goes on, he cites expansion, enrichment, developing social power. The middle class had new ways to make money as a result of the Industrial Revolution that had never existed previously because, or had never been available to the middle class, because there were now tools that made things that only people who were willing to put in a huge investment to do available to more people to do. Things like, if you wanted to publish a book before the printing press, you had a totally different pathway than after the printing press. If you wanted to publish a periodical before more changes to the mechanized version of the printing press took place.
It's all perfectly analogous.
Yeah.
It's all perfectly analogous to what happened after the invention of the internet, by the way.
Yes.
For any of that, read any of this, and this is why the people in charge of the television are so rabidly fighting against anything that exists on the internet for exactly the same reasons, because they had a stranglehold on mass communication until the 21st century. You couldn't mass communicate anything unless you were on the television or in the press or something. But then the internet came along, and any ordinary Tom, Dick, and Harry could not just get rich off this stuff, but could communicate en masse to the public ideas that would never previously be allowed. And it's all, it's history repeating itself. No less than 500 years later, 600 years later, somewhere.
Yeah. But so basically, you were able to do things as a middle class individual in the height of the Industrial Revolution, or the beginning even of the Industrial Revolution, that you wouldn't have been able to imagine doing, 50, 100 years earlier, because the money just wouldn't have been there. The things that you could buy to make it possible wouldn't have been there. You'd have been screwed. And as the other thing that happened was, as the expansion of industrial production took place, like mass production took place. You saw more people working jobs outside of owning a business at home. So your success didn't depend on your ability to run a business. It depended on your ability to do your job. Just perform a repetitive action. And while you might still be in the lower income echelons, you would have money that you wouldn't have had before. Like, you'd have been, if you had a dry spell with your business, you were kind of screwed. But you had a steady income from a factory, right? So there were a bunch of different things like that changed there that sort of gave people a structure within which to protest. Miller also points out the effect of the Second French Revolution, the July Revolution. The British aristocratic elite feared that they, too, might fall victim to revolutionaries, and the electoral reform became the best option to prevent a revolution. So if the middle class were not given a voice in their government feared that they, and their less economically fortunate countrymen, would fight for it. So what can be laid out here is standards linking voting rights with the status that historically associated with military obligation and civic duty. Those didn't change. You still had, even after the 1832 Reform Act, you still had a tiny percentage of the population voting. And that during that 400 years, there were only tiny little variations here and there based on local laws and things like that. What did change was the level of power that existed in government. You had the power of Parliament expanding and the power of the monarchy reducing to a huge degree. So due to an international pattern of uprising, like in the 19th century, you started to see more expansion. So the expansion pattern taking place was from men and women who were responsible for communities to men who were responsible for their tenants or their businesses and their families to working men who were responsible just for their families. But it was still based on levels of responsibility, not just something that was handed out willy-nilly. Preceding this change was the comparative levels of power the people's elective representatives had. So here we started with the king being in charge of everything, the queen being in charge of everything when there was a queen, and just taking advice from the Great Council up until the 13th century. And by the 19th century, you had Parliament doing most of the decision-making, and the monarch choosing to sign off on it or not, basically. So this is something that, modern times has completely changed. Even where the monarchy still exists, the prime minister takes on the function that as an executive power, right? So you're seeing more of a system of government instead of an individual government. And the monarchs do still have some responsibilities, but they are not in charge. Like, they don't make the laws, they don't decide what the government is going to do. They're not running the country. So that's basically where voting changed, is what you were voting for, and how much power the people that you were voting for had, versus them having very little power and just representing to a government that could decide to not follow their advice. But the real Easter egg here is this article I'm going to open and I better put a link to this in our little chat here too. This is something that was unknown, at least by modern students of history, until 2013, I want to say, is when this came out. So this is a 2013 document the article is from 2013 as well. The document is from 1843. So after the Great Reform Act of 1832, which is when feminists say that the rights to vote were enshrined in law as male only because the law said men, right? So this after that, but before the 1918 Representation of the People Act that restored the right to some women. And this is where we will take a break from other aspects of history. And let me open this up. I think we do have some time to go through this. And it might take a minute because I had to go with an archive. And it is wanting to... Let's see if I can open it in a different tab. We're just going to stop that. No, it's going to be just as slow because fuck me, right? But when I first saw this, there we go. When I first saw this, I was not as surprised as I should have been because I had my suspicions. But it was posted on Reddit, and at that point, the Telegraph was not behind a paywall. I linked this when I wrote about the suffragettes not being able to save feminism. And I'll reference that a little bit more when I talk about the United States because I wrote sort of a summary of U.S. voting expansion history in that article. But in this, we're going to find out that actually, cue the image that feminists always use when one of us says actually women could vote before the suffragettes. Women voted 75 years before they were, quote, legally allowed to in 1918. And this is old. This is an old article, 11 years old. A new document has surfaced which shows British women of all classes voting in 1843, some 75 years before they received the parliamentary franchise in 1918.
A new document.
Yes, a new document, which is
just
actually
like
an old document.
All these new documents that are suddenly arising about Ivor Brixton and all these things we weren't allowed to say 3 years ago. And yeah, it's not a new document. It's a document that you've only just allowed people to see 100 years after it already existed.
Right.
Yes.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It's kind of like Pfizer releasing the data from their stupid injection. 100 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. God damn.
Let me see if I can fix it. Somebody's complaining about my mic is as high as I can get it. So I'll have to.
I can hear you just fine. Hang on, I'll listen to that.
There we go. I had you turned up because you were very quiet in a recent episode of something else, and I could barely hear you. So it's Discord. I'm having.
You sound fine on the YouTube as well.
Yeah. So I think I fixed it. So okay. So a tuned flux will have to tell me if it made a change in the sound. Let's see. Back to the article though. I want to hit it without. There we go. So I want to go back and select it. For some reason, my windows are not showing. There we go. I had the bottom of the that bar at the bottom of the page that you can switch between windows. It wasn't giving me that for some reason all of a sudden. So let's scroll up. So this was written by Sarah Richardson, Associate Professor of History at the University of Warwick. So, and it was published on the 18th of March, 2013. And she says, occasionally, just occasionally, you encounter a document that radically changes your view of the past. This happened to me very recently. The source was just a few scraps of parchment in a box of solicitor's papers. So attorney's papers, correct? Solicitors or attorneys in Litchfield. But at a stroke, it provided me with tangible proof that Victorian women were not only eligible to vote, but actually exercised that right some 75 years before they received the parliamentary franchise in 1918.
But it was only women who were powerful, and if we describe women as necessarily not powerful, then none of this ever happened, and we can burn down all of this evidence, much like those Iraqi soldiers smashed down all those statues, and then it'll be fine. As long as the evidence is destroyed, it doesn't exist anymore. Hurrah!
Yeah. The document in question was a poll book for the election to the local office of Assistant Overseer of the Poor in the parish of St. Chad's, Litchfield, in 1843. I was tipped off about its existence by a friend, Philip Salmon, of the History of Parliament. And that link does still work. I looked, but it's a lot of that stuff is actually behind a paywall or a certification wall. You have to be in a university to see a lot of that stuff. So, but it was a schedule of voters, their addresses, the rates they paid, and how they voted. But as I looked down the list of names, some immediately jumped off the page. Elizabeth Shorthouse, which I will admit that I misread her name first time around. Hannah Holyman, Phoebe Skelton, and Anne Marlett. In all, there were 30 women playing an active role in the election. Although I knew that, in theory, women retained the right to vote for some local officials in the 19th century, I had never seen any evidence of them doing so in practice. This lack of evidence had led me, and many other historians, to assume that voting was entirely a male prerogative before the 20th century. So, we talked last week about the fact that there was no nationwide law up until 1430, the Knights of the Shire Act, that governed who could or who could not vote in parliamentary elections. Right? That didn't exist until 1430. And in 1430, it didn't specify gender. It specified conditions. Women could.
There was no such thing as a vote in 1430, surely.
Yes, there was.
There was no such thing as a democratic government until.
We went over this just last week. It was 1430 was when, remember, in the 13th century, near the end of the 13th century, you saw the Great Council evolve into Parliament, into a parliamentary system. It didn't meet on a regular schedule necessarily until much later, but it did exist. And in the latter part of that era, you saw after the Second Barons' War, you saw commoners become represented by knights that were sent to Parliament, and they did have to vote for them. And there were election systems. We went over how the election systems were different in the shires, the counties, or the boroughs, and how the standards were different, depending on. But in each of those, there was no male or female.
I say there was no such thing as a democratic government until then, but the Roman Senate was technically democratic, but it was only senators that could vote on things. I'm talking about when the general public could vote on things.
Interesting you should bring up Rome. Because
Go on.
In my research into this, one of the things that I came across was it didn't really describe much about how voting evolved in the UK, but it did describe how the feudal system evolved in the UK and what it evolved out of. And that was the Roman landlord system. So kings and barons and lords and so on, that whole system evolved out of Rome, out of Roman control in Europe. All roads really do lead to Rome, guys. Everything we're doing
today... They lead
today,
away from Rome.
They have a direct... Yeah, it has a direct connection. It's sometimes a dotted line or a thin road. But yeah, we are right in the moment thinking about the Roman Empire. And actually what we do today, what we are doing now, what we are talking about was influenced by the Roman Empire. So there you go.
In many ways they had a lot of things right. In many ways they did not.
Well, you know,
I'm not telling you what the right answer it is, but it's, I don't know, I guess it's somewhere between emperors and kings.
You know that Rome's version of feminism, it was the bell that rang the toll for the death of the empire, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like as soon as they started stepping away from their system of division of responsibilities. It's not just a division of labor between the sexes. It's a division of responsibilities. I'll take responsibility for this. You take responsibility for that. And women lived in that system the same as men did for the longest time, and then all of a sudden went, well, your responsibilities come with rights that we want, but we don't want your responsibilities. We just want the rights. And then the empire died.
It's difficult to point to any empire that lasted for longer than 1,000 years, or any kingdom that has lasted for longer than 1,000 years. Beyond that, we can look to things below that, to just tribal situations, and tribal situations never even live to 100 years because they're so balkanized in the first place. And then we have to look to anything that goes beyond empires, and I guess that would be things led by governments, and we're led to believe that those things can exist for thousands of years, but we don't know that. And we can say, well, none of these systems have ever lived for longer than 1,000 years, but we don't know that as of yet. I mean, the U.S. government has existed for 250 years, which seems to be the average length of an empire. I mean, we're still looking for the optimum kind of governance that can last beyond 250 years. I mean, the Ottoman Empire lasted like 1,000 years or something, but that was largely because of slavery. Loads of empires existed for a long time, but largely because they were able to make use of the industry of slavery, if you can call it an industry. I guess slavery is this weird cross between agriculture and slavery, depending on what you consider to be to count as agriculture or industry.
Well, and if you look at modern history, the thing that ended slavery wasn't just morality. I think the Industrial Revolution had a significant effect. We just like we are being told that the modern revolution of I guess you could still call it an industrial revolution. It's It's more of, computerized systems, but we're still looking at automation. The automation revolution may be replacing a lot of modern jobs, and advancements in means of production have over the last century changed or replaced a lot of jobs. And AI may change or replace a lot of jobs in IT. This is, I think slavery was pretty much doomed as a system by the invention of machines that could replace human labor. And when it comes to slavery, that's a good thing. We don't really want to be exploiting humans when we don't have to. We can pay humans to do work, but if we had large swatches of the population, large whole nations that were going to exploit humans instead, then it's better that more machines were invented to do those things, because it takes away the excuse. The bad thing is, obviously, that now they're starting to replace paying jobs as well. And
well, the bad thing is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
To quote someone whom I will not name, the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for humanity, which has been a disaster for the slavery industry, and a boon for the industrial industry. But well, there's Ted Kaczynski argument, and yes, it has caused some problems. But this is where we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place. That the Industrial Revolution brought an end to the slavery industry, which is a good thing, but it also brought about all the things we're encountering now, which arguably are not as bad as slavery, but are rapidly becoming even worse. And so we're at this impasse in history where we try and figure out how to make it work for us.
Well, it'd be nice if we could figure out how to use tech without using it to kill each other. That would be a good step.
If we could have some kind of basic compassion for each other as men and women, that would be a good place in which to plant the seeds of the technological revolution. And when I say men and women, I'm like, if only we could respect men for their existence as men, as well as respect women for their existence as women. That would be some fertile soil in which to plant.
We could just start treating men like human
technological
beings.
Revolution. Yeah, that would be great. Wouldn't that be great?
I would much appreciate that. It'd be even better than if we would come into work on Saturday.
That seems like that would be all it would take.
Yeah.
But humanity in general seems to not be on board with that.
No, and in fact, our society, our civilization. Sorry, I don't know where that came from, but our civilization can't even stop lying about men. We've been told. This has been one of the fundamental principles of patriarchy theory, that men kept women out of power. Men kept women from exercising the power of the franchise that men had. And the reason I've been going over this voting history, right? When you go to school in the United States, in elementary school, junior high school, middle school if you have it, which is just another word for some of the grades in elementary school or junior high school, you get taught that men always had the right to vote, but women didn't get their voting rights until much later. Men didn't always have the right to vote. Men had to fight and bleed and die for the right to vote. And they did it to keep the monarchy from confiscating property that men fought for and using it for its own purposes without the input of the people that they were taking it from. That's why men fought for the right to vote. And most men didn't get it. Most men didn't get the right to vote. Most men had no voting rights until shortly before women got universal voting rights.
Yeah, and slavery was largely upheld by this idea of, no, we have to put men to work. We have to make men pick cotton. We have to make men act as the machines of our society. Because if we don't do that, then what on earth else are we supposed to do? And then someone invented machines. Well, a bunch of people invented machines, and they went, look, we don't have to put men to work. We can put machines to work instead. And a whole bunch of people were like, no, we have to put men to work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, these machines of yours, machines aren't a thing. How very dare you? You're a misogynist or something. And a bunch of people had to say, no, actually, there are alternatives to turning men into machines. We can actually do that. And what we're experiencing now in the technological revolution it seems to be a similar thing. Look, we don't have to make men slaves. We can actually. There is an alternative to this, and I know that sounds like it's incomparable, but at the same time, maybe it's not. Maybe we could replace what were once male slaves with machines, and a whole bunch of people are going, no, we need to make men slaves. How could we possibly exist as a species without making men slaves? It's again, it's history repeating itself. Once it was the agricultural revolution, and then it was the industrial revolution, and now it's the technological revolution. They're all different iterations of the. We can't possibly exist as a species without enslaving men. And I'm like, maybe we can. Maybe we can. It is a possibility. And drawing ever closer to the idea that maybe we can exist as a species without making men slaves. I know, it's mental, isn't it? It's a fucking mental idea that we could exist as a species without making men slaves. But yeah, it is. We're getting closer and closer, and every new revolution, we're thrown up with this wall of nonsense, trying to make it impossible. But maybe it's not impossible.
Yeah. No, it's. I think it's not impossible. I think we just have a lot of work to do. Starting with not lying about men, like that would be a good start if society would stop lying about men and stop lying about this whole patriarchal idea. What this article sort of gave me in terms of information and what to evaluate for history on. Was the fact that A, women could vote when feminists have told us that men kept women out of the franchise, and B, the standards were mostly the same for the sexes. The one thing that I will say is different is that women were never subject to anything resembling a selective service or a draft for going to war. Men were. And remember last week, one of the things that we pointed out was taxes evolved as a system for paying one group of men paying other men to substitute for them in that requirement of being prepared to defend their land. So if you lived far away from the king and the king needed to send a military body to defend or attack, and you weren't going, then the king could raise his army locally by hiring mercenaries with money that you paid. That was the proto-tax system that he would send out to barons in distant areas and say, hey, we're going to war, we're doing this, I need to pay mercenaries if you don't want to send soldiers. And women who paid taxes were participating in that part of that system. But prior to the existence of that system, the proto-military, the feared, didn't include women. So that is something that it's a line that needs to be drawn from that system, that was a male-only system, to even when women could vote. What the only standard that men met that they didn't was military service, and that history of military service and the attachment of that history of military service to their tax paying. And the difference between that proto-tax system versus the modern tax system was that respect of the Great Council system made that something that these men agreed to. And they didn't go and agree to it and then their underlings had to pay the tax. The people who were making that agreement were the ones paying the tax. So they would go and have counsel with the king, and the king made his decision, or the queen, because there were queens that did this as well. And the monarch would make this decision based on the support from the barons. And if the barons were not supportive, the monarch couldn't just enforce the decision, as the First Barons' War showed. When they didn't agree to fund the actions of the monarch, they went to war and said, no, fuck you, we're going to fight this. And things have to change, or there will be blood. And when things didn't change, there was blood, right? Women were not participants in that. And yet, when voting expanded based on taxes, women who paid their taxes, who were property owners, who were independent of men, they still had the right to vote, and they exercised it. So that's something that, the reason that I want this emphasized is because we're told this is is evidence of patriarchy. This story that women were not included in the franchise prior to the suffragettes. This is part of the evidence that men have kept women down for centuries, and yet here we are. These names, these 30 names from this one area, they indicate that this was not true. And if it's happening in this one area, it's happening in other areas as well, right? And we have this record because this particular area was monitored. It was a marginal constituency in the period. The party wanted to keep tabs on the political temperature. The solicitor would have compiled a poll book from ballot papers returned by the voters. In the period before the secret ballot, let me see if, there we go. Sorry about that. Hope everybody's not getting motion sickness. But in the period before the secret ballot, everyone was entitled to know how people voted. So, this is, you could see who they voted for in the image where the handwriting is. You can see their vote, how much they paid, I think, or their name, how much they paid, and who they voted for. It was unusual to have an election for this particular office. It was a powerful post responsible for collecting poor rates and deciding how they were allocated. So that basically was the head of the welfare system at the time. Overseers were usually appointed to avoid the expense of an election. All heads of households paying rates were entitled to vote. all heads of households. So these women were heads of households. This was a very wide franchise, and one that included single and widowed women. So she goes on, my assumption was that women would be of genteel status. But as I checked their names against the 1841 census return, I was surprised to see the diversity in the group of votes. There were a few women of independent means owning property and land. There were also women, probably widows, who had inherited their husbands' businesses. So, for example, the wealthiest female actor on the roll was Grace Brown, a butcher, who managed a large household, including several servants. Due to the high rates she paid, Grace was entitled to 4 votes in the election, which she cast in favor of the conservative candidate. But I was amazed to see many women on the list who were far lower down the social scale, including the laundress, Carolyn Edge, the servant, Sarah Payne, and even paupers, including Sarah Batkin of Stowe Street. So this wasn't just regular, this wasn't just the middle class, right? This was women who owned their own home. This was, remember we talked about the people who got the right to vote by boiling their own kettle, their own pot, in their own home, at their own fireplace. Like that would be, she may have been considered a pauper, but she wasn't on the dole, essentially. The poll book is all that remains of an unremarkable local parish election in a comfortable Midlands market town in the mid-19th century, yet it has prompted a need to rewrite the history books by providing the first substantial proof that women were able to vote long before they received the parliamentary or municipal franchise. So it's interesting to look at this, and the reason, like I said, I wanted to go over this is that lie about patriarchy. So for all of the time that the men's rights movement has been in conflict with feminists, we've been told that we are agents of something that kept women from power for centuries. Yet we have evidence that women had that power. They weren't kept from power. They were just subject to the same expectations for being able to exercise it that a man would be subject to. And not even all of them. The most demanding expectation that men faced was death, willing to die for the right to have their say in how their government was run. Women didn't face that. They just had to pay. They had to pay somebody else to die. I'd say we had it pretty easy. I don't know. Any thoughts?
It's it's not even. I'm trying to draw this between class systems, and the women have always had the opportunity to, certain women of a certain wealth have always had the opportunity to vote for the government they wanted. It's just that no one of a lower class has ever had the opportunity to vote for these things, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that people weren't voting on behalf of any particular class below them. People have been voting for systems that would benefit them and any other class below them. No, I did have a solid thought in my head earlier on. I'm just trying to get it round now. It's that it wasn't that people always voted for the upper class. It was people voted in their own interests. And that was both men and women of upper class and upper class voted in their own interests. And that included upper class men and upper class women. And they always did so, and it was always in their own interests. And they didn't even pretend to vote in the interests of the lower class. They voted in the interests of their own class. And I know a lot of the John Stewart types like to say there's no such thing as trickle down economics, and yet nowadays, what you call trickle down economics doesn't really work like the straw man you call it does work. But in those days it did, because people would invest in their own businesses, and if they succeeded, they succeeded, and they became Coca-Cola. If they didn't succeed, then it did trickle down. And when anyone is allowed to invest in the risks in which they wish to take place, then those risks present themselves as risks, and if you do well, then you become billionaires, and if they don't, then your business liquidates, and it is trickled down into those things, and it was always able to trickle down from not just the rich men but the rich women into the descendants of what could happen, which is no longer the case, because anything you might have called trickle down economics before no longer exists, because men only have that option if they are successful. Women have that option even if they are not successful. Women nowadays represent a pool into which those economics trickle down, into which they are collected, and with even though women could build upon their initial success back in the Victorian days, and so could men. Nowadays, people can't build upon that initial success because it's not allowed, because they're sort of they are considered, despite being on top of the economic pyramid, they're considered lower down on the caste system pyramid. The caste system nowadays is based on demographics, namely men and women, and it's the current day caste system is no longer based on success, and so no one is given the incentive to work on their business, because it sort of doesn't matter anymore. Success isn't based on what you can invest through hard work. It's based on what it's based on the caste system that is drawn upwards based on what the model of what was once downwards.
Well, in fact, you end up in a position where if you are successful and you're from the wrong part of the caste system, you end up having your fruits of your labor and of your risk taking confiscated and redistributed to people in the right parts of the caste system. I like what you're talking about is kind of, it used to be that what trickle down referred to was, the individual that becomes successful in an endeavor. They take the risk, they create a product or service or some combination of both, and it becomes popular or relied upon by people, and they end up needing to expand their production of it. They need to be able to expand their provision of it to the public, so they increase the size of their business, and they hire people. And so part of the money that they are making goes to the people that they have hired to do parts of the job. And the whole job is still the creation and distribution of this product, service, or combination of both to the general public, so that people who want it can buy it. And that whole job brings in a whole gross profit, and then parts of that gross profit are distributed to parts of the business, the people that do their part of that job, and the risk taker at the head of it, who does all of the management of the business, has his share. So the part that the workers get paid, the part that the manufacturers of the supplies that they need to do their part get paid, the transport part gets paid, and all of that has trickled down from the head of the business. And at the same time, those individuals then go out and spend money at other businesses, and as those expenditures happen and that commerce takes place, lower and lower areas of the economy see some of those dollars from that top dog. And that's basically trickle down in a nutshell. Unfortunately, we have developed a tendency for the federal government and the state government to take bigger and bigger chunks out of those dollars, and those bigger and bigger chunks leave less to trickle. And there are a combination of market interferences in the form of grants and in the form of regulations and tax manipulation. So, for instance, let's say the company is Coca-Cola, like Mike mentioned. If Coca-Cola hires Brad, and Brad is a white guy who has never been impoverished, he's never used food stamps or Medicaid or any of those services, he's just, gotten out of high school and gone to work in a factory, and there isn't any part of the case system where he is in one of the right boxes to tick. Coke doesn't get a tax incentive to hire him. But if Brad is of an ethnic background that is historically considered disadvantaged, that's a box they can tick and say, well, Bradley is Native American or part Native American, or he is black, or he is an immigrant, his second generation of an immigrant family from Mexico, and so then they get a tax incentive, small one, but a little bit. If he's female, suddenly, if it's Bradlerina, I don't know what the feminine version of Bradley is, but Brenda, yeah, Brenda goes to work there. There's an automatic tax incentive because Brenda's female. And then if Brenda ticks off one of those other boxes, there's more. If Brenda was on aid to dependent families, for instance, there's an incentive there. There's a tax break for hiring.
risk is supposed to be part of life,
right?
not just now, but all the way back through our evolutionary history.
Well, the point
We
being that the interference and trickle down is that now Brad's cut off from the trickle if he's white and middle class. But go on.
yeah, like I say, risk has always been part of. I'm not going to say human nature, but it's always been part of what has been exacted in. I mean, that's where we cross from tribalistic human Stone Age nature to what we call civilization. That some people are willing to take more risks, and some people are less willing to take those risks, and that seems to be what has taken us from mud huts in Africa to cathedrals in Europe, and that's pardon. That's what should be. That's what we should encourage in order to continue on that trajectory. But it's what's being discouraged by so many of these forces in which I will include what I'm reluctant to call the government or the state. We're surrounded by these forces that are determined to discourage us from taking risks. And that's not necessarily misandric in its nature, but it's misandric in its practice, because men take more risks than women. That's something that any psychologist, evolutionary or otherwise, will tell you. Men are more willing to take risks than women, and you know, we're now surrounded by these forces that are determined to stop us from taking these risks, because they would rather regulate everything. Dare I call it communism? Dare I call it this collective push to make us less risk-taking, this collective push to make us more, not even equal, but equitable. Like, it's not just this equality of outcome, but this continually collective desire to make us less willing to take risks, because if we don't take risks, then in the end we'll all be equal. And that sounds beautiful on paper, but in practice it doesn't work, because without people who are willing to take risks, people who are willing to either fall into the top percentile or the bottom percentile, then we're all just going to average out into the medium percentile, which is what every other species does. Not just animal species, but plant species. This is what every species does. They average out into whatever will work according to the environment. And yet you can see how that produces a certain equilibrium. Mm-hmm. And yes, you can see why that works if your only interest is in this natural equilibrium. But this is what makes humans different from all the other animal species, from all the other plant species, from all the other fungi species. That we're able to rise above that. It's the reason we're able to go beyond mud huts, to be able to create cities that can span from horizon to horizon. The reason we're able to go to the fucking moon and maybe even Mars, if that's possible. And you know, maybe you're of the mindset where you're like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. Maybe you're like, fuck the moon. Maybe you're like, fuck Mars. We don't need to do that shit. And yeah, fine, but I, I, I put it to you that that is where that is where the argument reaches its impasse.
Yeah.
Like, should we be the kind of species that that reaches its apex at mud huts on the African plains, or a species that can go further, that can develop all the way to Europe and Asia and America and all the way across the globe, and even to the moon and to Mars? And I would put it to you that, what's the point? What the fuck is the point in living in this universe if we're not gonna expand our horizons? I mean, yeah, we shouldn't expand our horizons so much that we kill all the other animals. And yeah, that's the different conversation. But these are different ideas of what progress is, and I'm sick of listening to people whose idea of progress is that we should prevent human beings from progressing any further than the African savannah. Yeah, I get it. I really do get it that maybe maybe we've progressed too far from the African savannah, but I think as far as we know, we're the only planet in the known universe that has developed life. And I think we should really indulge in this endeavor to spread life, perhaps the only life that has ever existed in the universe, to other places. And we're not going to do that if we keep insisting on degrowth.
Yeah, and that's all it is, Like, I don't know if we could bring life to other planets. Maybe I don't know if it would look similar to ours or anything that we would recognize as life, but I do think that we owe it to humanity to see how far we can go. You're absolutely right. But you see, I think that the government, the people in power, know that we do possess this capability. We do have genius people who are just sitting here with, they're solving math problems instead of trying to figure out how to advance, certain areas of technology or whatever. But what do you see the reaction is? They want to herd us all into 15-minute cities. So it's not a mud hut. We're not going back to mud huts, but it's very similar. It's more comfortable. It looks more like what we're used to, what we're familiar with.
Limiting.
But it's still a fucking but it's still a mud hut essentially. That's exactly what they want to do. They want to limit our capabilities. And that's why this lie about voting is so I really hate it, because you see these young women out here parroting the same thing over and over and over again. And I guarantee you, actual feminists, the ones who've been doing this for a long time, they know this information. They know it, but you'll never see them actually correcting the record because it only enhances their goals, which is more feminism.
It's a big part of the problem with women's voting habits, and we'll get into more about that in future episodes. But I really believe that and this is another reason why I feel that it's very important to go over this history. The pathway men took to vote created one set of voting habits, right? One attitude toward voting. And also the pathway men take to success in their lives. Your voting habits are partly based on what it takes for you to survive in your role and for you to thrive in your role as a man. Women do not face the same standards. They don't face the same expectations. Women don't have the same social obligations, the same legal obligations, and women do not have the same level of accountability. Our lives are very protected in comparison to those of men from various levels of risk. Women aren't just risk averse. Women are averse to other people taking risks. And women are safety net addicts. And when a woman is not a safety net addict, other women treat her like she's weird. And that goes clear back to childhood. Other girls will treat a girl who picks up bugs with her fingers and jumps between monkey bars and trees and sticks her hand in mud when she can't see what's in the mud and stuff like that, as a weirdo. Even though little boys do that shit all the time. And they're not weirdos for it, right? Little girls will say boys are gross for that, but they don't act like they're weird because they're used to that being a boy thing. So women are not just risk averse, and they're not just averse to other people taking risks, they're controlling about it. And that has resulted in a different voting pattern among women. And that voting pattern really needs to be, like, women need to be aware that they're doing that. Because without that awareness and without the recognition that prior to women voting being a common universal thing, we didn't have systems of government that robbed Peter to pay Paulina to spit out babies and not work and not marry her, the father of any of her children. Right? Before it was common for women to vote, our government didn't fund endless, constant attacks on other countries for living differently than we did. We did still have a tendency toward warmongering early in the 20th century, but it wasn't something. I don't think we would have had the history that we have today of people, voters in mass listening to our politicians say that we have to go attack this country and attack that country for being communist. I don't like communism. I think it's shit. But it's also the decision of the country that it's happening in our country, whether they develop a communist regime or not. And it's not right that the United States felt obligated or entitled to be the world police. And I think if women had been more conscientious in their voting patterns, I don't think that our population's children would have been sent to fight those battles. But in any case, we can get more into that as well as we get into the United States, Canada, and Australia. I've got a blurb at the end of the show notes about that. This is voting changed in the colonies that became countries before it changed in the UK in some ways, and like that's something that we'll discuss next week and in weeks after, because I know this is going to take more than 1 week to talk about. 3 different countries formed during and after the time period when reforms were taking place in the UK and how voting is done. And they all started with different election systems and evolved after they'd started. So we're going to have to talk about that. And I'm not sure whether I'm going to do... my mom had a history teacher that did this. My mom's history teacher had a timeline that had world history and the events taking place around the world at different times listed on it, instead of just America's timeline and England's timeline and so on. So you knew the French Revolution and the American Revolution were related to each other because of the influence of one on the other, which happened fairly close together, right? And you knew what was going on in the world in various countries at the start of World War I and at the start of World War II that contributed, because you could see it on the timeline. So I'm thinking I might do that with the timeline of voting in the United States, the UK, Canada, and Australia, like as each of these nations formed and their franchise formed and evolved. It did, I think, influence the UK, and at the same time, like the suffragette movements were influenced by each other as well. They were not little bubbles in each country where there was the UK suffragette bubble and the US suffragette bubble and the Canadian suffragette bubble. There was a worldwide movement. So that's something to look forward to. And it might be easier to do it the other way, where I talk about one country and then the next and then the next. But if I can, I'm going to try to talk about it in terms of things that were happening concurrently. If I find it important to do that and can't do the note combination, like put things together in a week, I will delay that show and talk about something else next week, and delay it to the week after, just so that I know I'm doing it well. But so I'm not going to promise that next week we're going to talk about the United States. But in the next couple of weeks, we will definitely get onto this part of the evolution of voting rights, and we'll talk more about the Reform Acts in the UK as well, because that's important information too. But in the meantime, just remember, we already saw that women were voting in the UK before feminists say they were voting in the UK. So don't be surprised if you find out that that was true in some place other than the UK. Namely, when we do talk about the United States, there are some aspects of the New Jersey voting system at the start of the nation that are kind of interesting and important to discuss as well. Mm-hmm. So with that, let's get into, we do have another super chat, a super chow, and a rumble rant to read. So the super chow is Meredith G, who gave us $5 and said HBR Talk 303, honey for the badgers. The super chat was from Albert Nader Retro, who gave us $5 Canadian and said, woman gets into a car accident, blames the patriarchy because men invented cars, streetlights, telephone poles, ketchup, women most affected. I don't know who invented ketchup, actually. That might have been a man, that might have been a woman, but whoever invented it, thanks. AnobaFan21 gave us $1 in a rumble rant and said, off topic, but France IGN made a claim that attractive women, Eve from Stellar Blade, cause direct harm to women. Have you done shows debunking that claim? Exactly how are attractive women harmful to other women? Exactly how? Because we don't have to imitate them. We don't have to. It's not like we don't even have to compete with them, really, because it's not like half the female population is made up of women who are significantly more attractive than the other half, and personality doesn't matter, right? Attractiveness in men and women, there's a small percentage that are highly attractive, and then there's a much greater percentage that are sort of somewhat attractive, maybe mid, maybe not so fabulous, and then there's a percentage at the bottom that's less attractive, and a small percentage that's unattractive. From what I've seen, in the general public, most people are not, and there's no harm to be had there.
The French like to think that their women are more adulterous than other women because they like to assume their women are more attractive than other women, and the rest of the world likes to assume that's the case because their women are more adulterous than other women. Not necessarily the case. French women are just whores. I mean, no one would say that because I'm English, but fuck you, it's true.
Oh, that's great. I don't know. I don't know if it's necessarily ethnic. Women in general, women have an easy cover, for that. If a conception happens, unless the person that the woman was cheating with looks significantly different than her partner, she seems to be able to pawn off the kid as the partner's kid, and nobody knows, nobody is any the wiser. And of course, modern women have the whole slut-shaming narrative. Oh, you can't slut-shame her, but she's betraying her partner. No, you're just mad that she had sex. No, she can have all the sex she wants with her partner, or they can have an open relationship, but she shouldn't lie to him and say she's not having sex with someone else when she really is. Slut-shame her! And it doesn't matter that actually, no, you're shaming her for lying about sex, not for having it. You're shaming her for betraying someone's trust, not for being intimate, but for violating that intimacy. You're still a slut shamer, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think that claim is so ridiculous that there needs to be substantial evidence provided. If somebody makes that claim, they need to explain exactly how that damage takes place. And if somebody just says, well, look at the source material, that means they didn't read it, they don't understand it, they saw the headline, and they think it's something that they can shoot at you with. And you need to call them out on that. What do you mean you don't understand the source material? Can't you explain briefly, give a list of ways and some supporting evidence that's from that? Tell me a paragraph and page number at least where I should be finding that information? Or did you just read the headline and think, hey, I have a gotcha right here. Look, there's a gotcha. Because it's not. I've never been harmed by the fact that there are other women who are more attractive than I am. That's never bothered me. In fact, it's fun to look at them. I quite enjoy that. And I've never been harmed by the fact that there are women who use makeup and hair extensions and all that stuff, aside from the fact that, they do pollute the environment and that harms everybody. But the actual physical appearance change, I look at that as entertainment, right? Look, this lady's eyelids are blue and sparkly. That's kind of cute. That's fun to look at. It's only when it makes her think she's better than me that I have a problem. And most of the time, most women who do that don't do it because they think they're better than everybody else, right? They do it because they think that their looks are inadequate or they want a particular effect. But it doesn't... even the social justice warrior tendency to dye their hair a rainbow of bizarre colors, right? It's interesting to look at that. Boys or girls, men or women, when people do creative things with their appearance, that's fun because we can look at that and enjoy the artwork, right? But no, we have to be upset about it. Women have to be victims of it somehow. And if they're not victims of having to do it, which we don't, because as I've said before, being allergic to all that shit has freed me from any obligation, and I actually find it completely unnecessary. The idea that we're victimized by discrimination against us because of other women doing it. Like, which isn't true either. I haven't had, an instance where I've not gotten a job because somebody came in with sparkly makeup and no better resume than me and got it instead. So, I don't think that's real either. I think that's bullshit. It just bugs me that women have to be victims of fucking everything. So, and women shouldn't be fucking everything anyway.
No, it's merely that the English should destroy the French in a massive war. I elaborate no further, and I leave.
You have to get rid of some of my DNA.
Yes, I will. I'm ready and willing to do that. I'm even ready and willing to destroy Lauren's French DNA. It's all worth it.
Gene therapy though.
To destroy the world of the French.
You can't
Fuck all of you.
Can't call it gene therapy because it's French, right? You have to call it Jean therapy.
There's no such thing as French. French is merely a social construction, and it's up to us to destroy all of it.
Does that mean I can't be frank with you?
It does.
And with that, we have one more super chat that came in from Albert Nader Retro, who gave us $2 and said, "My new catchphrase: ketchup, women most effective." Which, yeah. And we have another one. Albert Nader Retro gave us another $5 and said, "Feminism would have died in the 70s except Jane Fonda and Gloria Steinem made it fashionable because they were attractive. Ketchup, women most effective." Yeah. I don't know. I think that there was the establishment was behind feminism. So whether it was made fashionable by the attractiveness of some prominent feminists or not, it was going to be it was a psyop the whole time, guys. Sorry.
Yeah, you could go back in time and kill Jane Fonda and Gloria Steinem.
In Minecraft.
In Minecraft. Feminism still would have happened. It's much like the idea that you could go back in time and kill Adolf Hitler, and the Nazi revolution wouldn't have happened. No, it still would have.
Yeah.
Even if Hitler had never existed, the zeitgeist at the time was bound to produce some kind of Adolf Hitler. And for all you know, if you had killed baby Hitler, then the zeitgeist would have produced an even worse equivalent of Hitler. And the same thing goes for feminism. This was an inevitability. As society becomes more and more prosperous, it produces the seeds of feminism. This is just something we were bound to have to deal with as society became more prosperous. And we're now in the late stages of having to deal with the excesses of feminism. If there was never a Gloria Steinem or a Jane Fonda, there would have been a different Jane Fonda and a different Gloria Steinem, and it might have been even worse.
Yeah, the psyop would have happened no matter what. And what we would have had to do to prevent that, actually, if you wanted to destroy feminism in the 20th century, what you actually would have had to do would be to destroy the comfort that people had with sitting back and letting government make decisions for them, and letting the establishment that formed during the mid-20th century, that led to that feminist psyop in the latter half of the 20th century. And that would have meant no great society. Right? That would have meant no progressive movement. At least not no successful progressive movement. At least not a successful, widespread supported movement. Right? It would have been, people would have had to have been looking at that and going, "You're getting too addicted to safety nets. Stop it." And unfortunately, we didn't do that. I say we, I wasn't born yet, but American society didn't do that. the rest of the world didn't do that either. And as a result, we now have the worst the worst cancer that our political environment in the world has had. And that is gynocentrism, that is feminism, that is the progressive stack, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is the belief, the attitude that one group of people can matter more than another based on their immutable characteristics, and another group of people can matter less based on theirs. And with that, I think it is time to call it. We have read all of our various chats, and so I will thank everybody for listening to me delve into the history of suffrage and sort of crashing around like a bull in a china shop in regard to how I articulate that history, because there's a lot I could have included in this, but the show would have been 8 hours long, and I have to go to work tonight, so I can't do that. My co-hosts would be exhausted. They can't do that. So you get the crash course.
And we're just your various calves in a china shop, trying to
trying to keep up.
trying to break some china as well.
Yeah, I kind of plowed my way through this, a lot of this, because a lot of it's just giving you information, but I know a lot of it didn't lend itself to much commentary, but the overall discussion turned out pretty good, I think. So thanks you guys for bearing with me on that. So now we have a bull and a bear. I'm ready to market the episode, and we'll end with the puns. Good night, all. We will see you next Thursday.
See you next Thursday.
Men's rights activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.